Riley Harper pushed through the heavy glass doors of Blackstone Firearms Academy, her weathered duffel bag slung over one shoulder, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours, she would silence an entire room of elite shooters with a single, impossible shot that would split an instructor's coin clean in half. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of Nashville's most exclusive shooting facility, where million-dollar deals were made over the crack of precision rifles, and where people like Riley, quiet, modestly dressed, with calloused hands and worn boots, were never supposed to belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Around her, men in custom-tailored tactical gear discussed their latest equipment acquisitions, their voices carrying the easy confidence that came from never having to prove themselves to anyone. Crystal trophy cases lined the walls, filled with gleaming awards from regional and national competitions. The air itself seemed to hum with money and status, punctuated by the distant sound of high-end firearms being tested in the underground ranges. Riley's appearance told a different story entirely. Her faded jeans had seen better years, her plain black t-shirt bore no designer labels, and her worn leather boots had walked through places these men had only read about in magazines. She carried herself with a quiet stillness that most people mistook for uncertainty, but those who knew how to look would have recognized something else entirely, the controlled awareness of someone who had learned to survive in places where a moment's inattention could mean death. At the reception desk, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and manicured nails looked up from her phone with barely concealed irritation. Her name tag read Amber Reed, and her expression suggested that Riley's presence was an unwelcome interruption to her otherwise peaceful afternoon. "Can I help you?" Amber asked, her tone suggesting she'd rather not. "I'd like to book some range time," Riley replied, her voice soft but clear. "I have a day pass." Amber's eyes swept over Riley's modest appearance with practiced efficiency. No expensive watch, no designer accessories, no obvious signs of the kind of wealth that typically walked through these doors. She held out her hand with visible reluctance. "Day pass?" Riley reached into her duffel bag and produced a slightly wrinkled envelope. Inside was a guest pass signed by Dr. Patricia Lawson, one of Blackstone's board members and a psychiatrist who specialized in veteran affairs. Riley had been seeing Dr. Lawson for the past 6 months, part of her ongoing treatment for what the VA paperwork euphemistically called adjustment disorders. Amber examined the pass with the skepticism of a jeweler appraising a suspicious diamond. "Dr. Lawson's guests usually call ahead," she said finally, "and they usually dress differently." Before Riley could respond, a booming voice cut through the lobby's refined atmosphere. Well, what do we have here?" Connor Walsh strode across the marble floor like he owned not just the building, but the entire city block. At 34, he was Blackstone's head instructor and the facility's biggest draw. His perfectly pressed tactical shirt bore the logos of 3 major firearms manufacturers, and his custom holster held a pistol that cost more than most people's cars. Connor had the kind of aggressive charm that worked well in sales presentations and intimidated newcomers, backed by genuine skill that had earned him recognition in competitive shooting circuits across the Southeast. "First time at Blackstone?" Connor asked, his eyes taking in Riley's appearance with obvious amusement. "Let me guess, you saw our beginners classes advertised online?" "I just need range time," Riley said quietly, not meeting his gaze. Connor's smile widened. He'd seen dozens of women like this over the years, quiet, uncertain, probably sent by well-meaning family members who thought shooting lessons would help with confidence issues. They usually lasted about an hour before the noise and intimidation factor sent them running back to their comfort zones. "Range time," he repeated slowly, as if the words were foreign. "And what exactly are you planning to shoot?" Please tell me you're not carrying some little pink pistol in that bag." A few of the nearby members chuckled, drawn by the prospect of entertainment. Riley felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She'd experienced this before, the assumption that someone like her, someone quiet and unassuming, couldn't possibly belong in spaces reserved for the confident and the capable. "I have my own equipment," she said simply. "Your own equipment," Connor echoed, his voice carrying just enough mockery to make his audience smile. "Well, this should be interesting. Tell you what, how about we start you off with something simple? Basic safety course, maybe some instruction on proper stance? Can't have you hurting yourself on your first day." Riley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flickered behind her dark eyes, a flash of steel that Connor was too busy performing for his audience to notice. But Zoe Martinez, the range manager who had been quietly observing from behind the equipment counter, caught it immediately. Zoe had been running shooting facilities for 15 years, and she'd learned to read people the way others read books. There was something about Riley's stillness, her controlled breathing, the way she unconsciously checked her surroundings, that suggested this woman had been trained for far more than weekend target practice. "I'll take the basic range package," Riley said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing attention. 2 hours, station 12 if it's available." Connor glanced at his watch, a titanium chronograph that probably cost more than Riley's monthly rent. "Tell you what, sweetheart, I've got a better idea. How about a little demonstration? I was just about to show these gentlemen a precision drill. You could watch, learn something." The suggestion carried the weight of a challenge disguised as generosity. Riley could feel the eyes of the other members on her, waiting to see if she would accept her place as a spectator or dare to overstep the boundaries that people like Connor had established for people like her. "What kind of demonstration?" she asked. Connor's grin became predatory. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, holding it up so the light caught its surface. "Coin split. 50 yards, one shot. It's a little advanced for beginners, but I thought you might find it educational." The crowd that had gathered murmured with appreciation. Connor's coin-splitting demonstrations were legendary at Blackstone, a perfect marriage of showmanship and skill that reinforced his reputation as the facility's premier instructor. Riley looked at the coin, then at Connor, then at the faces surrounding her. Each expression told the same story. This was not her world. These were not her people. And the sooner she accepted that reality, the better for everyone involved. What they didn't know, what Connor couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Riley Harper had spent 3 years in the Syrian desert, where missing a shot meant watching your teammates die. They didn't know that she'd been trained by the finest marksmen in the U.S. Navy, or that her father, Commander David Harper, had been a SEAL instructor who'd taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bicycle. They saw a quiet woman with worn clothes and humble equipment. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had once put 3 rounds through a playing card at 600 yards while under enemy fire. "That sounds interesting," Riley said finally, her voice carrying the same quiet tone she'd maintained throughout the encounter. "Mind if I try it after you're done?" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of gunfire from the ranges below. Connor's confident smile faltered for just a moment, not because he was worried about the challenge, but because something in Riley's voice suggested she wasn't asking for permission. She was simply stating what was going to happen next. Connor Walsh felt the subtle shift in the room's energy, but his ego wouldn't allow him to interpret it as anything other than anticipation for his own performance. He'd been the star of Blackstone Firearms Academy for 4 years running, and in that time, he'd perfected not just his marksmanship, but his ability to read a room and play to his audience. "Well, aren't you ambitious?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that men like Connor had weaponized into an art form. "I appreciate the enthusiasm, really I do. But coin splitting isn't exactly something you work up to gradually. It takes years of training, thousands of rounds, and equipment that costs more than most people's cars. He gestured toward his custom rig, a precision rifle that had been hand-built by a master gunsmith in Colorado, complete with a scope that cost $8,000 and a trigger system so sensitive it could detect the shooter's heartbeat. "This isn't a hobby for me, sweetheart. This is what I do for a living." Riley nodded quietly, her expression unchanged. "I understand, do you?" Connor pressed, sensing an opportunity to cement his authority in front of the growing crowd. "Because I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself. These gentlemen here, they're serious competitors. Regional champions, state record holders. They come to Blackstone because they know they'll get instruction from someone who actually knows what he's talking about." Marcus Thompson, a real estate developer who held 3 state titles in precision rifle competition, stepped forward with an indulgent smile. Connor's being modest. Last month, he split a dime at 75 yards. Video went viral, over 2 million views. 2.3 million, Connor corrected with false humility. But who's counting? The small crowd chuckled appreciatively. These were Connor's people, wealthy, accomplished men who came to Blackstone. Not just for the exceptional facilities, but for the social validation that came with being part of an exclusive club. They paid premium prices to train with someone who made them feel like they were part of an elite brotherhood. And Connor had built his entire business model around feeding that particular fantasy. Riley stood quietly at the edge of the group, her weathered duffel bag looking increasingly out of place among the designer gun cases and high-end equipment that surrounded her. To the casual observer, she might have seemed intimidated or uncertain, but Zoe Martinez was beginning to notice details that others missed. The way Riley's eyes automatically cataloged exits and sightlines. The unconscious way she positioned herself to keep her back to a wall. The controlled breathing pattern that suggested someone who had learned to manage stress in high-pressure situations. Most telling of all was the way she carried herself, not with the self-conscious uncertainty of someone out of their depth, but with the quiet stillness of someone conserving energy for what was to come. "Tell you what," Connor continued, warming to his theme, "how about we start you off with something more appropriate? We've got a nice little .22 that's perfect for beginners. Nice and gentle, won't hurt your shoulder. Maybe work on hitting a paper target at 25 yards before we start talking about trick shots." "That's very considerate," Riley replied, her voice remaining level despite the growing condescension. "But I brought my own equipment." Connor's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "Your own equipment? Well, by all means, let's see what we're working with." Riley knelt beside her duffel bag and began unpacking with methodical precision. First came a worn leather gun case that had clearly seen considerable use. The leather was scratched and faded, held together in places with military-grade tape. When she opened it, the crowd leaned forward with barely concealed curiosity. Inside was a rifle that told a completely different story than its humble container. It was a Remington M24S, the same weapon system used by U.S. Army snipers for decades. The rifle had been modified with a custom barrel and a scope that, while not as flashy as Connor's equipment, bore the subtle markings of genuine military-grade optics. "Interesting choice," Connor said, his tone now carrying a note of genuine puzzlement. "Where exactly did you pick up something like that?" "It was a gift," Riley said simply, running her hand along the rifle's stock with the familiarity of someone who had maintained the weapon countless times. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say in front of this crowd, was that the rifle had belonged to her father, Commander David Harper. It was the weapon he'd used during 3 tours in Afghanistan, the one he'd carried during operations that remained classified even after his death. Before his final deployment, he'd spent months teaching Riley to shoot with this exact rifle, preparing her for a future he somehow sensed he wouldn't be around to protect her through. Connor examined the rifle with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it, and his expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the sporting goods store purchase he'd expected. This was a serious weapon, maintained by someone who understood its capabilities. "Well," he said finally, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence, "I have to admit, you've got good taste in equipment. Though I hope you didn't pay full retail for something in that condition." A few members of his audience chuckled, but the laughter seemed forced now. There was something about the way Riley handled the rifle, the automatic way she checked the action, the unconscious muscle memory of her movements that suggested this wasn't a woman playing dress-up with borrowed equipment. "Condition doesn't affect performance," Riley said quietly, beginning to set up her shooting rest with movements that were both economical and precise. "At least, that's what I was taught." "And who exactly taught you?" Connor asked, unable to keep a slight edge out of his voice. For the first time since entering Blackstone, Riley's composed expression flickered. Pain flashed across her features so quickly that most of the crowd missed it entirely. But Connor caught it, and something about that moment of vulnerability restored his confidence. "Someone who knew what he was doing," she said finally. Connor sensed an opportunity to regain control of the situation. "Well, I'm sure your instructor was very enthusiastic, but there's a difference between backyard plinking and precision shooting at a facility like this. Different pressures, different expectations." He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd, the expensive equipment, the pristine facility that surrounded them. "This isn't a county fair shooting gallery, sweetheart. This is where serious shooters come to test themselves against the best." Riley finished her preparations and stood, the rifle cradled in her arms with casual competence. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet tone she'd maintained throughout the encounter, but now there was something else underneath it, something that made Zoe Martinez take an unconscious step forward. "I understand the difference," Riley said, "and I'm still interested in trying that coin split." The silence that followed was loaded with tension. Connor found himself in an unexpected position. He'd built his reputation on being the undisputed king of Blackstone Firearms Academy, the instructor who could humble any challenger while entertaining his paying customers. But something about Riley's quiet confidence was beginning to make him question his assumptions. Still, he had an audience to consider and a reputation to maintain. Whatever this woman's story was, she was still just one person standing against everything he'd built. And in Connor's experience, quiet confidence usually crumbled pretty quickly when faced with real pressure. "All right then," he said, his smile returning with renewed force. "Let's see what you've got." What Connor didn't realize was that he had just challenged someone who had learned to shoot in places where missing meant people died. Someone who had been trained by the best marksman in the world, and who carried the memory of her father's lessons in every controlled breath, every steady heartbeat, every moment of perfect stillness before the shot. Riley Harper had accepted his challenge, and in less than an hour, she was going to teach Connor Walsh and everyone else at Blackstone Firearms Academy exactly what precision shooting really looked like. The atmosphere in Blackstone's main training area had shifted from casual afternoon conversation to something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Word had spread quickly through the facility's various ranges and lounges that Connor Walsh was about to put on one of his legendary demonstrations, but this time with an unexpected twist. Some unknown woman had actually challenged him to match his performance. Within minutes, nearly 30 people had gathered around Range Station 7, the facility's premium long-distance setup. The crowd included Blackstone's most elite members: Marcus Thompson with his collection of state championships, Vincent Harper, who owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Nashville, and Stella Kim, whose pharmaceutical company had sponsored the last 3 regional competitions. These weren't casual weekend shooters. They were people accustomed to excellence, and they'd come to witness what they assumed would be a masterclass in the difference between professional competence and amateur ambition. Connor basked in the attention as he meticulously prepared his equipment. His custom rifle was a work of art as much as a precision instrument, its carbon fiber stock gleaming under the range's LED lighting system. Every component had been hand-selected and perfectly calibrated, from the match-grade barrel that had cost more than most people's monthly salary to the trigger system so sensitive it could detect the microscopic tremor of a heartbeat. 50 yards, he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Standard silver dollar. One shot, clean split down the middle. He held up the coin, allowing the light to catch its polished surface as he walked down to the target area. With theatrical precision, he placed the silver dollar in a specially designed holder that would keep it perfectly vertical, then returned to the firing line where his audience waited with barely contained anticipation. Riley watched the proceedings with the same quiet attention she'd maintained since entering the facility. She had positioned herself slightly apart from the main crowd, her weathered rifle case resting against her leg, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. To most observers, she appeared nervous or uncertain, exactly what they expected from someone so obviously out of her depth. But Zoe Martinez, observing from her position behind the equipment counter, was beginning to notice details that painted a different picture. The way Riley's breathing had become deeper and more controlled, following a pattern that suggested someone trained in stress management techniques. The unconscious way she flexed and relaxed her hands, maintaining circulation and dexterity. Most telling of all was her posture, not the hunched shoulders of someone feeling intimidated, but the alert stillness of someone preparing for action. Connor settled into his shooting position with the fluid grace of countless hours of practice. His stance was textbook perfect, his grip precisely calibrated, his breathing falling into the rhythm that had carried him through dozens of competitions. The crowd fell silent as he aligned his sight picture, the only sound the facility's ventilation system and the distant murmur of activity from the other ranges. The shot rang out like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. 50 yards downrange, the silver dollar split into two perfect halves, each piece spinning away from the target holder in glittering arcs that caught the light before falling to the concrete floor. The crowd erupted in applause and appreciative whistles. It was a perfect demonstration of precision marksmanship, the kind of shot that separated genuine masters from weekend enthusiasts. Connor stood and acknowledged the praise with the practiced humility of someone who knew exactly how impressive his performance had been. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the range, "that's how it's done when you've dedicated your life to the craft." Marcus Thompson stepped forward to examine the target area, shaking his head in admiration. "Clean. Split, dead center. Connor, I swear you make it look easy." 23 years of practice, Connor replied, beginning to pack his equipment with satisfied efficiency. "Started when I was 11 years old, and I've been pushing the envelope ever since." The crowd began to disperse, already discussing what they'd witnessed and planning to share videos of the demonstration on their social media accounts. Connor's coin-splitting videos had a way of going viral, bringing prestige to Blackstone and reinforcing his reputation as one of the premier shooting instructors in the Southeast. It was Vincent Harper who remembered the original arrangement. "Wait a minute," he called out, his voice cutting through the congratulatory chatter. "Didn't someone else want to try this?" All eyes turned to Riley, who had remained motionless throughout Connor's performance. She met their gaze with the same calm expression she'd maintained since entering the facility, then nodded quietly. "If the offer's still open," she said simply. Connor's confident smile faltered for just a moment. In the aftermath of his perfect performance, he'd almost forgotten about the strange woman with the worn equipment and quiet demeanor. Part of him had hoped she would simply slip away, intimidated by the demonstration she'd just witnessed. "The offer's still open," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "Though I have to warn you, That wasn't exactly a beginner's exercise you just watched. Riley nodded and moved toward her equipment case with the same methodical precision she'd displayed earlier. As she began unpacking her rifle, Connor found himself studying her movements more carefully. There was something about the way she handled the weapon, not with the careful reverence of someone afraid of making a mistake, but with the casual competence of someone for whom this was simply another tool. "Have you ever attempted a coin split before?" Connor asked, unable to keep a slight condescension out of his voice. "Not exactly," Riley replied, checking her rifle's action with movements that were both economical and automatic. The crowd murmured with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Several members exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared thought. This was going to be painful to watch. They liked Connor, respected his abilities, and had no desire to see some amateur embarrass herself in front of Nashville's most exclusive shooting community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley finished her preparations and walked down to the target area where the remnants of Connor's silver dollar still glittered on the concrete floor. She carried her own coin, a simple quarter that looked almost shabby compared to the pristine silver dollar Connor had used. As she placed it in the target holder, her movements were steady and unhurried, showing none of the nervous energy that might be expected from someone about to attempt an extremely difficult shot in front of a critical audience. When she returned to the firing line, Connor felt compelled to offer one final piece of advice. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying what he imagined was helpful concern, "this isn't about strength or aggression. Precision shooting is about control, patience, and accepting your limitations." Riley nodded politely, then settled into her shooting position. As she did, something shifted in her demeanor, a transformation so subtle that most of the crowd missed it entirely. Her breathing deepened and slowed, falling into a rhythm that spoke of countless hours of training. Her body settled into the rifle's natural point of aim with the automatic precision of muscle memory. For the first time since entering Blackstone Firearms Academy, Riley Harper looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been trained to kill at distances these people couldn't imagine, by instructors whose standards made Connor Walsh's achievements look like child's play. The range fell silent as she aligned her sight picture. 50 yards downrange, the quarter waited in its holder, a target so small that even Connor's perfect demonstration had seemed miraculous. What the crowd didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Riley Harper had once put 3 rounds through a playing card at 600 yards while under enemy fire. A quarter at 50 yards wasn't a challenge for someone with her training. It was barely even practice. Time seemed to slow as Riley Harper settled into her final shooting position. The range's ventilation system created a subtle background hum, but otherwise the space had fallen into the kind of absolute silence that only occurred when 30 elite shooters collectively held their breath. Even Connor Walsh, despite his confidence in the outcome, found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the same magnetic tension that had captured everyone else's attention. Riley's transformation was now complete. Gone was any trace of the uncertain woman who had shuffled through Blackstone's marble lobby an hour earlier. In her place was someone who moved with the fluid precision of a professional, every gesture economical and purposeful. Her breathing had fallen into a rhythm so controlled it seemed to stop entirely, and her hands settled onto the rifle with the kind of natural grace that spoke of thousands of hours of training. Through her scope, the quarter looked impossibly small. At 50 yards, the coin appeared as little more than a thin vertical line, its edges barely visible even with magnification. The slightest tremor, the smallest miscalculation, would send the bullet wide of the mark. It was the kind of shot that separated legitimate masters from talented amateurs, which was exactly why Connor had chosen it for his demonstrations. But as Riley aligned her sight picture, Muscle memory kicked in from places these people couldn't. Imagine, Syrian hillsides where missing meant watching teammates die. Training ranges at Quantico, where her father had taught her that precision wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about bringing everyone home alive. Countless hours of practice were good enough, was never good enough, because in the real world, there were no participation trophies. The crowd watched with fascination as Riley made minute adjustments to her position. To most observers, her movements appeared hesitant, uncertain, exactly what they expected from someone attempting something beyond her capabilities. But Zoe Martinez, whose 15 years of range management had taught her to read shooters like books, recognized something entirely different. Riley wasn't hesitating. She was calculating wind speed, air density, the slight imperfections in the facility's climate control that created microscopic air currents, the ambient temperature that would affect her ammunition's performance, variables that casual shooters never considered, but that military snipers processed automatically, the way other people processed breathing. Connor checked his expensive chronograph and cleared his throat softly. "Take your time," he said, his voice carrying what he imagined was encouraging patience. "Precision shooting can't be rushed." Riley didn't respond. Her focus had narrowed to the kind of tunnel vision that combat veterans knew well, a state where everything outside the immediate task ceased to exist. The crowd, the pressure, Connor's condescending commentary, all of it faded into background noise as her world condensed to the simple geometry of bullet trajectory and target placement. Her finger found the trigger with automatic precision, settling into the exact position her father had taught her 20 years earlier. Commander David Harper had been a legendary marksman, someone whose reputation extended far beyond the Navy SEAL community. His lessons had been carved into Riley's muscle memory through thousands of repetitions, reinforced by the kind of real-world application that most shooters only read about in magazines. "Remember, sweetheart," Connor added, unable to resist one final piece of advice. "It's better to miss clean than to barely clip the edge. At least then you maintain some dignity." Several members of the crowd chuckled softly, but the sound felt forced in the tense atmosphere. There was something about Riley's stillness, her complete absorption in the task, that was beginning to make even Connor question his assumptions. This wasn't the nervous fumbling he'd expected. This was something else entirely. Riley's breathing stopped. The shot exploded through the range like a thunderclap, the sound reverberating off the walls with shocking intensity. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved. 50 yards downrange, the quarter holder stood empty, the coin having vanished so completely that several spectators wondered if it had somehow fallen out on its own. Then Marcus Thompson stepped forward, his expression puzzled. "Did she miss it entirely?" he asked, moving toward the target area to investigate. What he found defied immediate comprehension. The quarter hadn't missed. It had been split so perfectly down the center that both halves had flown clear of the target holder, landing several feet apart on the concrete floor. But unlike Connor's silver dollar, which had been cleanly bisected, Riley's quarter showed something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The cut wasn't just clean, it was surgical. The bullet had found the exact geometric center of the coin with such precision that both halves were perfectly symmetrical, their edges so smooth they looked like they'd been cut by a laser rather than split by kinetic force. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, picking up one of the pieces and examining it under the range's bright lighting. "She didn't just split it. She cut it perfectly in half." The silence that followed was profound, not the expectant quiet that had preceded Riley's shot, but the stunned, disbelieving silence of people whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. Connor Walsh, regional champion and Blackstone's premier instructor, stared at the quarter fragments with an expression that cycled through confusion, denial, and something approaching fear. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The precision required for that kind of shot, the margin of error is literally microscopic. Zoe Martinez stepped forward to examine the evidence herself, her experienced eye taking in details that others missed. The angle of the cut, the consistency of the bullet's path, the complete absence of secondary damage that would indicate a lucky ricochet. This wasn't beginner's luck or a fortunate accident. This was the work of someone operating at a level that most competitive shooters never achieved. "Who are you?" Connor asked, turning to face Riley with an expression that had lost all traces of its earlier confidence. Riley was already packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the afternoon. She looked up at Connor with eyes that held no trace of triumph or satisfaction, only the quiet composure of someone who had simply done what was expected of her. "I told you," she said softly. "Just someone who learned from someone who knew what he was doing." Vincent Harper pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with excitement. "That was incredible. I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Where did you train? Who was your instructor?" For the first time since entering Blackstone, Riley's composed expression showed a crack of emotion. Pain flashed across her features so quickly that most of the crowd missed it, but Connor caught it. And something about that moment of vulnerability made him realize that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple shooting demonstration. "My father," Riley said finally, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Commander David Harper, United States Navy SEALs." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several members exchanged glances of recognition, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. Commander David Harper wasn't just known within military circles, his reputation had extended into the civilian shooting community, where his legendary marksmanship skills had become the stuff of legend. Connor Walsh felt the world shift beneath his feet as he realized exactly what had just happened. He hadn't been beaten by some amateur with beginner's luck. He'd been outclassed by someone trained by one of the finest marksmen in military history, someone whose quiet competence had been forged in places where precision meant survival. Riley finished packing her equipment and shouldered her worn duffel bag, ready to leave as quietly as she'd arrived. But as she turned toward the exit, Connor's voice stopped her. "Wait," he called out, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. "That shot, that level of precision, it's not possible unless—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought that was forming in his mind. Because if Riley Harper could split a quarter with surgical precision using worn equipment and no warm-up shots, then everything he thought he knew about marksmanship, about his own abilities, about the hierarchy he'd spent years building at, Blackstone was about to be turned completely upside down, and deep down, Connor Walsh was beginning to suspect that Riley's demonstration was just the beginning. Connor Walsh spent the rest of that afternoon in his office, staring at his collection of trophies and certificates with eyes that no longer saw their familiar gleam. The perfectly split quarter sat on his desk like an accusation, its surgical precision mocking every achievement he'd accumulated over 23 years of competitive shooting. Each time he looked at it, the same impossible question echoed through his mind. How had someone with worn equipment and humble clothes just made the most perfect shot he'd ever witnessed? By evening, Connor's wounded pride had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous, a determination to prove that what he'd witnessed was somehow illegitimate. There had to be an explanation that didn't require him to accept that everything he'd built his identity around was fundamentally inferior to whatever Riley Harper represented. He started with the basics, pulling up Blackstone's member database and cross-referencing Dr. Patricia Lawson's guest pass records. Riley's information was sparse: current address in a modest apartment complex in East Nashville. Employment listed as administrative assistant at a local accounting firm. No competitive shooting history, no certifications or training records. That would explain her abilities, But it was the emergency contact information that made Connor's breath catch. In case of emergency, contact Caleb Stone. The name meant nothing to Connor initially, but a quick internet search revealed something that made his hands tremble slightly as he scrolled through the results. Caleb Stone, former U.S. Navy SEAL, 3 tours in Afghanistan, currently working as a private security consultant in Nashville. The connection to Riley's father was obvious, but what disturbed Connor more was the realization that Riley Harper wasn't just some random woman who'd wandered into his facility. She was connected to a network of people whose professional competence made his regional championships look like high school participation trophies. Connor's research deepened as the night wore on. Commander David Harper's military record was largely classified, but the available information painted a picture that made Connor increasingly uncomfortable. Multiple deployments, specialized marksmanship training, instructor certifications that indicated someone operating at the absolute pinnacle of professional standards. Most unsettling of all were the oblique references to classified operations and specialized reconnaissance missions that suggested Commander Harper had been involved in activities that civilian shooters could barely comprehend. The pieces of Riley's background began falling into place like a puzzle Connor wished he'd never started assembling. Her father hadn't just been a good shot, he'd been a legitimate legend within military circles, someone whose reputation extended far beyond the Navy SEAL community. If Commander Harper had trained his daughter with even a fraction of his professional standards, then what Connor had witnessed wasn't an anomaly. It was Riley operating well below her actual capabilities. By midnight, Connor had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Riley Harper's background, and every piece of information made him feel smaller and more threatened. Her modest apartment, her quiet job, her humble equipment, none of it mattered when viewed against the reality of her training. She was essentially a professional athlete, pretending to be an amateur, a Ferrari disguised as an economy car, but it was the final piece of research that pushed Connor's wounded pride into something approaching desperation. A casualty report from 18 months earlier revealed that Commander David Harper had been killed in a training accident at Naval Air Station Pensacola. The report was heavily redacted, but the timing suggested that Riley's appearance at Blackstone wasn't random chance. She was dealing with grief in the only way she knew how, by honoring her father's memory through the skills he'd taught her. Connor closed his laptop and walked to his office window, looking out over Nashville's glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, Riley Harper was probably sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that she'd just destroyed everything Connor thought he knew about his own abilities. She'd walked into his world, demonstrated superiority so casual it seemed effortless, and then disappeared back into anonymity like nothing had happened. The rational part of Connor's mind recognized that Riley's demonstration had been a masterpiece of precision shooting, the kind of performance that should inspire respect and admiration. But the emotional core of his identity, built on years of being the best shooter in every room he entered, couldn't accept that reality. If Riley Harper could make shots like that with casual ease, then what did that say about Connor's own achievements? What did it say about the empire he built at Blackstone? Meanwhile, 3 miles away in her small apartment, Riley sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a worn photo album. The images showed a younger version of herself, alongside Commander David Harper, both of them in military fatigues at various shooting ranges around the world. In every photo, her father's expression carried the same quiet intensity that Riley had displayed at Blackstone, the look of someone for whom precision wasn't just a skill, but a sacred responsibility. She turned to a page near the album's end, where a handwritten letter was carefully preserved behind protective plastic. The letter was addressed to her, written in her father's precise script, and dated just weeks before his final deployment. "Riley," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're probably wondering what to do with everything I've taught you. The skills we've practiced together aren't just about hitting targets. They're about carrying forward something important, something that matters beyond trophies or recognition. Rayleigh's finger traced the familiar words as she continued reading. You have a gift that goes beyond natural talent. You have the discipline to use that gift responsibly, and the character to use it for something larger than yourself. Don't hide from what you're capable of, but don't let it define you either. Use it when it matters, and always remember that the most important shot is the one that brings everyone home safely. The letter concluded with advice that had been haunting Riley since her father's death. Find your tribe, sweetheart. Find people who understand what we've shared and help them remember why precision matters. The world has enough people who shoot for glory. It needs more people who shoot for something that matters. Riley closed the album and walked to her window, looking out over the same Nashville skyline that Connor was contemplating from his office. She had no idea that her demonstration at Blackstone had sent shockwaves through Connor's carefully constructed world, or that he was currently plotting ways to discredit what she'd accomplished. All she knew was that for the first time since her father's death, she'd felt the familiar comfort of perfect precision. The quarter split had been technically flawless, but more importantly, it had been a connection to everything her father had taught her about excellence, discipline, and the responsibility that came with exceptional ability. Tomorrow she would return to her quiet job at the accounting firm, blend back into the anonymity that had protected her since leaving the military. But something had changed during those few minutes at Blackstone. She'd stepped out of the shadows, if only briefly, and remembered what it felt like to honor her father's memory through the skills he'd given her. What Riley didn't know was that Connor Walsh had no intention of letting her disappear back into anonymity. His wounded pride and threatened identity were already formulating plans that would force her back into the spotlight. Whether she wanted to be there or not, the stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond simple marksmanship. It would become a test of character, integrity, and the true meaning of excellence under pressure. 3 days later, Riley returned to Blackstone Firearms Academy for what she hoped would be a quiet practice session. Dr. Lawson had suggested that regular shooting might help with her ongoing therapy, providing a constructive outlet for the complex emotions surrounding her father's death. Riley had no intention of causing another scene or drawing attention to herself. She simply wanted to honor her father's memory through the discipline he'd taught her. But the moment she walked through Blackstone's glass doors, Riley knew that anonymity was no longer an option. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she passed, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking her movement across the marble lobby. Word of her coin-splitting demonstration had spread far beyond the original witnesses, growing in the telling until it had achieved almost mythical status among Nashville's shooting community. Connor Walsh was waiting for her at the reception desk, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd assembled what looked like a war council of Blackstone's most influential members. Marcus Thompson with his collection of state championships, Vincent Harper, whose pharmaceutical empire sponsored half the regional competitions, and Stella Kim, who served on the boards of 3 different shooting organizations. Behind them stood a younger man with a press badge and a professional camera, introduced as Jake Morrison from Tennessee Shooting Sports Monthly. Riley Harper, Connor announced as she approached, his voice carrying across the lobby with theatrical authority. Just the person we were hoping to see. Riley felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the setup. This wasn't a casual encounter, it was an ambush, carefully orchestrated to put her in a position where backing down would seem like cowardice and moving forward would expose her to scrutiny she wasn't prepared for. "Mr. Walsh," she replied quietly, maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her. While in far more dangerous situations than this, Connor stepped forward with the confident smile of someone who'd spent 3 days planning this moment. "I've been thinking about your demonstration the other day. Remarkable shooting, really remarkable. But it got me wondering, was that performance repeatable, or were we all witnesses to a once-in-a-lifetime lucky shot? The question hung in the air, like a challenge disguised as curiosity. Riley could see the trap being laid, but she also understood that Connor's ego wouldn't allow him to simply let her disappear back into anonymity. Her casual destruction of his carefully constructed superiority had wounded something fundamental in his self-image, and now he needed vindication. "I'm just here for practice," Riley said simply. Of course," Connor replied, his tone suggesting understanding while his eyes promised anything, but practice is so much more effective when it's structured, don't you think? When there are clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Marcus Thompson stepped forward with a folder full of papers, his expression carrying the serious intensity of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. What Connor is proposing is a formal competition. 10 stations, varying distances and weapons, judged according to International Precision Shooting Federation standards. Winner takes $50,000 in prize money. The amount was significant enough to make Riley's breath catch. $50,000 would cover her father's funeral expenses, pay off the debt she'd accumulated during her transition out of the military, and provide the financial stability she'd been struggling to achieve since leaving active duty. But she also recognized that the money wasn't really the point. This was about Connor's need to prove that her demonstration had been an aberration. "And if I lose?" Riley asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Connor's smile became predatory. "If you lose, you're banned from Blackstone permanently. No more guest passes, no more charity cases disrupting our training environment. This facility returns to being what it's always been, a place for serious competitors with serious credentials." The terms were harsh enough to make several witnesses shift uncomfortably, but Riley understood the psychology behind them. Connor wasn't just challenging her marksmanship. He was attacking her right to exist in spaces that people like him considered their exclusive domain. Jake Morrison raised his camera, clearly anticipating a dramatic response that would make good copy for his magazine. The assembled crowd leaned forward with barely concealed excitement, expecting either capitulation or theatrics. What they got instead was the same quiet composure that had characterized all of Riley's interactions at Blackstone. "When?" she asked. Simply. Connor blinked, clearly having expected more resistance. "1 week from today. Sunday afternoon. Full gallery, official judges. We'll livestream the entire event to ensure complete transparency." Riley nodded slowly, her mind already calculating what the next 7 days would require. She would need to contact Caleb Stone, arrange for additional practice time, and prepare herself mentally for the kind of public scrutiny that went against every instinct her military training had developed. But as she looked around the assembled crowd, seeing the mixture of anticipation, condescension, and barely disguised hostility, Riley felt something awaken inside her that had been sleeping since her father's death. Not anger exactly, but a quiet determination to prove that excellence couldn't be bought with expensive equipment or intimidated by social pressure. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby with crystal clarity. The murmur that went through the crowd wasn't mockery this time, it was shock. Several members exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared thought. This woman either had tremendous confidence in her abilities or no idea what she'd just agreed to face. Connor extended his hand with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just maneuvered an opponent into an unwinnable position. "Excellent. I look forward to a fair competition." As they shook hands, Riley met his gaze with steady brown eyes that held no trace of fear or uncertainty. "So do I, Mr. Walsh." What Connor didn't realize was that Riley Harper had just been handed exactly what she needed, a chance to honor her father's memory, not through quiet practice sessions, but through the kind of public demonstration of excellence that would make Commander David Harper proud. That evening, Riley sat in her apartment with her father's letter spread on the table before her, rereading the words that had guided her since his death. Use it when it matters, the letter advised. And always remember that the most important shot is the one that brings everyone home safely. Connor Walsh thought he'd engineered a trap that would expose Riley as a fraud and restore his damaged reputation. What he'd actually done was create the perfect opportunity for Riley to step fully into the legacy her father had left her, not as a woman hiding from her abilities, but as someone ready to demonstrate what genuine excellence looked like when it was built on discipline, character, and the kind of training that most people could only dream about. The next 7 days would determine whether Connor's expensive equipment and home field advantage could overcome the simple reality that Riley Harper had been trained by one of the finest marksmen in military history. In conditions where missing meant people died, Riley reached for her phone to call Caleb Stone. It was time to prepare for the most important competition of her life, not because of the money or the recognition, but because her father's memory deserved nothing less than her absolute best. Riley's hands trembled slightly as she dialed Caleb Stone's number that evening. She hadn't spoken to any of her father's old teammates since the funeral 18 months earlier, partly because their presence reminded her too painfully of what she'd lost, and partly because she wasn't sure she deserved their continued loyalty now that Commander Harper was gone. "Riley?" Caleb's voice carried surprise and immediate concern. "Jesus, it's good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "I need help," Riley said simply, cutting through the pleasantries that would only make this conversation harder. "I've gotten myself into something, and I can't handle it alone." Caleb's tone shifted immediately to the focused attention that had made him one of the Navy's most effective operators. "Talk to me." Riley explained the situation at Blackstone Connor's challenge, the stakes involved, the public nature of the competition that would livestream her performance to thousands of viewers. As she spoke, she could hear Caleb processing the information with the same tactical mindset that had kept them all alive during 3 tours in Afghanistan. 50 grand prize, permanent ban if you lose, full media coverage, Caleb summarized. When she finished, "Riley, this isn't just a shooting competition anymore. This is psychological warfare. This Connor guy isn't trying to beat you. He's trying to destroy your confidence, so completely that you'll never pick up a rifle again." "I know," Riley replied, "but I can't back down now. Not after what Dad taught me about excellence and responsibility." There was a long pause before Caleb spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the warmth that had made him like an uncle to Riley throughout her childhood. "Your father would be proud that you're willing to stand up for what matters. But he'd also want to make sure you're prepared for what you're facing. Will you help me?" "Hell yes, I'll help you," Caleb said without hesitation. "But we're going to train like your life depends on it, because in a way, it does. Meet me tomorrow at 0600 at the old range outside Murfreesboro. Bring everything you've got, and prepare to remember why your father was the best instructor the team's ever produced." The next morning, Riley drove through pre-dawn darkness to a facility that looked like it had been abandoned since the Cold War. Weathered concrete buildings sat surrounded by overgrown fields, with target arrays that stretched out to distances that made Blackstone's 50-yard demonstrations look like indoor parlor games. This was where Commander Harper had brought his most promising students when they needed to learn what precision really meant. Caleb was waiting for her with a duffel bag full of equipment that made Riley's modest gear look like toys. But more importantly, he'd brought something that made her breath catch: her father's complete training manual, annotated with notes from 20 years of developing the finest marksmen in the military. "Your dad wrote this for you," Caleb said, handing her the leather-bound notebook. "Every lesson he ever taught, every technique he ever developed, every secret he learned about pushing human performance beyond normal limits, he started working on it the day you were born, and he finished it just before his last deployment." Riley opened the manual with reverent hands, finding page after page of her father's precise handwriting. wind calculations, breathing techniques, equipment modifications, and psychological preparation methods that went far beyond anything taught in civilian shooting schools. This wasn't just instruction, it was a masterclass in perfection. "We've got 6 days," Caleb continued, his voice carrying the authority that had made him an effective leader in impossible situations. 6 days to take you from someone who can make lucky shots to someone who can perform miracles under pressure. Your natural ability is already beyond anything most people will ever achieve. But natural ability isn't enough when you're facing someone with home field advantage and unlimited resources. The training that followed was unlike anything Riley had experienced since leaving active duty. Caleb pushed her through scenarios that tested not just her marksmanship, but her ability to maintain precision under stress, fatigue, and deliberate distraction. They worked through equipment malfunctions, hostile environments, and psychological pressure designed to break concentration. On the 3rd day, Caleb introduced variables that made Riley understand why her father's reputation had been legendary, even among elite operators. Moving targets that required split-second calculations, extreme distances that pushed her equipment beyond its designed limits, multiple target scenarios that demanded perfect accuracy under time pressure. "Your father used to say that amateurs practice until they get it right," Caleb explained as Riley struggled through a particularly challenging drill. "Professionals practice until they can't get it wrong. We're not trying to make you good enough to beat Connor Walsh, we're making you so good that you could beat him blindfolded." By the 5th day, something had awakened in Riley that had been dormant since her father's death. Not just her technical skills, but the mindset that separated genuine masters from talented amateurs. The ability to remain calm when everything around her was chaos. The discipline to execute perfect technique even when exhaustion and pressure threatened to overwhelm her concentration. Caleb watched her progress with growing amazement. "Your father always said you had ice in your veins when it mattered," he told her as she completed a sequence of shots that would have been impossible for most professional shooters. "But this is something else entirely. You're not just channeling his training, you're exceeding it." On the final day of preparation, Caleb set up a drill that replicated the exact conditions Riley would face at Blackstone. 10 stations, varying distances, multiple weapon systems, with artificial crowd noise and deliberate distractions designed to simulate the hostile environment Connor was planning. Riley moved through the course with mechanical precision, her performance so flawless that Caleb found himself holding his breath. Every shot found its mark with surgical accuracy. Every transition between stations was executed with professional efficiency. Every response to pressure or distraction demonstrated the kind of mental toughness that couldn't be taught, only forged through experience and preparation. When the final shot echoed across the range, Caleb walked over to examine the targets with an expression of genuine awe. "Riley," he said quietly, "your father trained some of the finest marksmen in military history, but what you just did, I've never seen anything like it." Riley looked up from packing her equipment, her face showing the calm confidence of someone who had rediscovered what she was truly capable of. "I'm ready," she said simply. As they drove back toward Nashville, Caleb glanced at Riley with the pride of someone who had just witnessed greatness in action. "Your father would be proud," he said. "But more than that, he'd be excited to see what you're about to teach those people about what real excellence looks like." Tomorrow, Riley Harper would walk into Blackstone Firearms Academy not as someone hiding from her abilities, but as someone prepared to demonstrate the full extent of what Commander David Harper's daughter was capable of achieving. Connor Walsh had no idea what was coming for him. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Riley Harper drove through Nashville's empty streets toward Blackstone Firearms Academy, her father's training manual on the passenger seat beside her and his rifle secured in the back. She'd slept better the night before than she had in months, Her mind finally quiet after 6 days of intensive preparation that had awakened abilities she'd forgotten she possessed. But as she turned into Blackstone's parking lot, Riley realized that Connor Walsh had transformed what was supposed to be a private competition into something resembling a major sporting event. Television trucks from 3 local news stations crowded the lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Like technological monuments, spectators streamed through the entrance carrying folding chairs and coolers, their conversations buzzing with excitement about the showdown they'd come to witness. Inside, Blackstone had been reconfigured into something between a shooting range and a television studio. Professional lighting rigs illuminated the firing stations, multiple cameras had been positioned to capture every angle, and a commentator's booth had been erected overlooking the main competition area. Electronic scoreboards displayed the competitors' names: Connor Walsh, regional champion, 6-time state record holder, and Riley Harper, challenger, with biographical information that made the disparity between them seem almost comical. Connor held court near the equipment check station, surrounded by sponsors whose logos decorated everything from his shooting vest to the banners hanging throughout the facility. He wore a custom competition suit that probably cost more than Riley's monthly rent, and his entourage included coaches, equipment specialists, and what appeared to be a professional photographer documenting his preparation process. Riley arrived, wearing the same modest clothes she'd worn to every practice session, carrying her father's weathered rifle case and a small gym bag containing her gear. The contrast with Connor's elaborate setup was so stark that several spectators actually laughed when they saw her, assuming she was either lost or delivering something for the real competitor. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the event coordinator, a man named Roger Bailey, who normally managed corporate shooting events, "we're about 5 minutes from beginning what promises to be an extraordinary demonstration of precision marksmanship. Before we start, let me remind everyone that this is a formal competition conducted according to International Precision Shooting Federation standards, with official judges and electronic scoring systems." The crowd settled into their seats with anticipatory energy. Most were Connor's supporters, Blackstone members, local shooting enthusiasts, and media representatives who'd come expecting to witness a masterclass in the difference between professional competence and amateur ambition. They saw Connor as Nashville shooting sports ambassador, a local celebrity whose skills had brought prestige to their community. Riley found herself assigned to preparation area number 2, a small station behind the main firing line where she could organize her equipment away from the cameras and crowd noise. As she unpacked her gear with methodical precision, she became aware that people were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed pity. "Poor woman," she heard someone whisper. "She has no idea what she's gotten herself into." "Connor's going to destroy her," another voice added. "This is going to be painful to watch." But Zoe Martinez, observing from her position behind the scoring table, noticed details that others missed. The way Riley's hands moved with automatic efficiency as she prepared her equipment. The controlled breathing pattern that suggested someone managing stress through professional techniques. Most tellingly, the complete absence of nervous energy that should have been overwhelming someone facing their first major competition. "Station 1, Connor Walsh," Roger Bailey announced through the facility's sound system. "Station 2, Riley Harper. Competitors, please verify your equipment with the range safety officers." Connor approached the equipment check with the confident stride of someone who had done this dozens of times. His custom rifle was a technological marvel, every component hand-selected and perfectly calibrated, with optics that cost more than most people's cars. The range safety officer examined the weapon with obvious appreciation, clearly impressed by the level of craftsmanship and sophistication. Riley's equipment inspection drew a different reaction. Her rifle was obviously military surplus, well-maintained, but showing the wear patterns of extensive use. The scope, while functional, lacked the bells and whistles that characterized modern competition equipment. Several spectators exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared thought. This was going to be over quickly. "Competitors ready?" Bailey called out. The format is 10 stations, varying distances from 25 to 300 yards. 5 shots per station, scored according to precision and consistency. Total possible score is 500 points. Connor raised his hand with theatrical confidence. "Ready," Riley simply nodded, her expression showing the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the week's preparation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bailey continued, "Station 1 will test basic precision at 25 yards, using standard target rings. Competitors have 2 minutes to complete 5 shots." The crowd fell silent as Connor settled into his shooting position. His form was textbook perfect, his movements fluid and practiced. The first shot rang out clear and true, followed immediately by electronic confirmation. 9.8 points. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Connor was already performing at a level that most recreational shooters could only dream of achieving. His second, third, and fourth shots maintained the same high standard, each score appearing instantly on the overhead displays. "Final shot, Station 1, Bailey announced as Connor aligned his sight picture one last time. The shot echoed through the facility, followed by the electronic score, 9.9 points. Connor Walsh total, 48.7 out of 50 possible points. The crowd erupted in appreciative applause. It was an excellent opening performance, the kind of score that typically won competitions outright. Connor stood and acknowledged the praise with practiced humility, but his confident smile made it clear that he considered the contest essentially over. "Riley Harper, Station 1, Bailey called out. Riley approached the firing line with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed throughout her preparation. As she settled into position, something shifted in her demeanor, a transformation so subtle that most of the crowd missed it entirely. Her breathing deepened and slowed, her body found its natural point of aim, and her hands settled onto the rifle with the automatic precision of muscle memory forged through thousands of hours of training. The range fell silent as she aligned her sight picture. Through her scope, the target looked almost insultingly large compared to the challenges Caleb had put her through during the past week. 25 yards was barely warm-up distance for someone trained to engage targets at distances these people couldn't imagine. Riley's first shot rang out with authority, followed immediately by electronic confirmation that made the crowd's collective intake of breath audible. 10.0 points, perfect score. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the facility's ventilation system. Connor's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized that Riley Harper had just achieved something he hadn't managed in his opening performance, absolute perfection. But as Riley prepared for her second shot, she was thinking not about scores or competition, but about her father's voice echoing across training ranges from years past. "Excellence isn't about being better than someone else, sweetheart. It's about being better than you were yesterday." 4 more shots remained at Station 1, and Riley Harper was just getting started. Riley's second shot at Station 1 produced another perfect 10.0, followed by her third and fourth, each electronic confirmation hitting the crowd like a physical blow. By the time she aligned her sight picture for the final shot of the opening station, an unsettling quiet had settled over Blackstone Firearms Academy. This wasn't the comfortable silence of spectators watching expected excellence. This was the stunned hush of people witnessing something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. "Final shot, Station 1, Roger Bailey announced, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that he couldn't quite suppress. Riley's fifth shot rang out with the same authority as the previous 4, and the electronic scoreboard confirmed what everyone could see but few could accept. 10.0 points. Riley Harper total, 50.0 out of 50 possible points. Perfect score. The silence that followed was broken by Connor's voice, tight with forced confidence. Beginner's luck always looks impressive at close range. Let's see how she handles the real challenges. But as the competition progressed through stations 2, 3, and 4, Riley's performance didn't decline, it became even more surgical. 50 yards, 75 yards, 100 yards distances that should have challenged someone using basic equipment and operating under intense pressure. Instead, Riley moved through each station with mechanical precision, her shots finding their marks with a consistency that made Connor's excellent scores look merely adequate. By Station 5, Connor's confident demeanor had transformed into something harder and more desperate. His equipment manager, a nervous man named Pete Daniels, leaned close during a brief break between stations. "She's not missing," Pete whispered urgently. "Not even close. At this rate, she's going to make you look like an amateur." Connor's jaw tightened as he watched Riley prepare for the next station with the same calm efficiency she displayed throughout the competition. The crowd's energy had shifted dramatically. What had started as polite attention to the challenger had become genuine fascination with someone operating at a level most of them had never witnessed. "Do something," Connor muttered to Pete, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "Like what?" "I don't care what. Equipment malfunction, scoring error, something that breaks her rhythm. Just make it look accidental." Pete's expression showed reluctance, but he nodded and moved toward the equipment area where Riley's gear was staged between stations. While she was occupied with Station 5, a challenging 150-yard precision drill, Pete made subtle adjustments to her rifle scope, introducing a microscopic misalignment that should have thrown off her point of impact. Riley completed Station 5 with another perfect score, but as she moved to Station 6, something felt different about her rifle. The scope's eye relief seemed slightly off, and there was a barely perceptible shift in the weapon's balance. A recreational shooter might have attributed these sensations to fatigue or nerves, but Riley's training had taught her to recognize equipment tampering immediately. She glanced toward the equipment area and caught Pete Daniels quickly looking away, his expression guilty enough to confirm her suspicions. For a moment, anger flashed through Riley's mind, not at the sabotage itself, but at the insult it represented. Connor Walsh wasn't just trying to beat her. He was trying to cheat someone who had been trained by people who understood honor, integrity, and the meaning of fair competition. But then her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Equipment failure is just another variable to overcome, sweetheart. Professionals adapt. Amateurs make excuses." Riley made rapid mental calculations based on the scope's altered alignment, then adjusted her shooting position to compensate. Station 6 required engaging targets at 200 yards a distance, where even tiny equipment problems could cause dramatic misses. The crowd watched with growing tension as Riley settled into her modified shooting stance. Her first shot at the adjusted station hit slightly off-center, still well within the scoring rings, but visibly different from her previous perfection. The crowd murmured with what sounded almost like relief, as if Riley's near miss had restored the natural order of things. Connor's confidence returned immediately. "There we go," he said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. Reality always catches up eventually. But Riley's second shot found the exact center of the target, followed by her third and fourth. She had identified the equipment problem, calculated the necessary compensation, and adapted her technique accordingly. By her fifth shot, she was back to perfect precision, having overcome Connor's sabotage through pure skill and professional training. The electronic scoreboard confirmed another perfect station score, and Connor's face went pale as he realized that his cheating had not only failed, but had actually demonstrated Riley's superiority even more dramatically. She hadn't just maintained her performance despite equipment tampering, she'd overcome deliberate sabotage while competing in front of hostile spectators using equipment inferior to his own. Station 7 brought even more desperate measures. As Riley prepared for the most challenging portion of the competition, 300 yards with modified targets, Connor's photographer began using his camera's flash at precisely the moment she was taking each shot. The brilliant strobing light was designed to destroy her concentration and ruin her sight picture. Most shooters would have been thrown completely off their game by such obvious interference. But Riley had been trained in environments where enemy snipers used muzzle flashes, explosions, and deliberate distraction as standard tactics. Connor's photographer was presenting challenges that seemed almost quaint compared to what she'd overcome during her father's training. She adapted by timing her shots between the flash sequences, using the brief moments of normal lighting to achieve perfect sight alignment. Her scores remained flawless despite increasingly obvious attempts at sabotage. The crowd began to notice the dirty tactics, and murmurs of disapproval started rippling through the spectator area. Zoe Martinez approached the judges' table with concerns about the photographer's behavior, while several longtime Blackstone members exchanged uncomfortable glances as they realized what Connor was willing to do to avoid losing. "This is getting ugly," Marcus Thompson said quietly to Vincent Harper. "Connor's making us all look bad." By Station 8, Connor had abandoned any pretense of fair competition. His equipment manager introduced deliberate malfunctions in the functions. Manager introduced deliberate malfunctions in the Zenking electronic scoring system whenever Riley achieved perfect shots, forcing manual verification that disrupted her rhythm and created artificial delays. His photographer continued the strobe tactics while adding crowd noise designed to break her concentration, but every attempt at sabotage only served to highlight Riley's extraordinary competence. She overcame each obstacle with calm professionalism, never complaining, never making excuses, simply adapting her technique and maintaining the standard of excellence her father had taught her to pursue. As they prepared for Station 9, the penultimate challenge, Connor Walsh was facing the complete collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. His expensive equipment, his home field advantage, his psychological warfare, even his outright cheating had proven inadequate against someone who represented a level of training and character he couldn't match. Riley Harper wasn't just beating him. She was teaching everyone present what genuine excellence looked like when it was built on integrity rather than ego, substance rather than showmanship. 2 stations remained, and Connor was about to learn that there were no depths he could sink to that would overcome the simple reality of Riley's superior preparation and unshakable character. Station 9 arrived with the weight of inevitability hanging over Blackstone Firearms Academy. Despite Connor's increasingly desperate sabotage attempts, Riley Harper maintained a commanding lead that seemed mathematically insurmountable. Her cumulative score approached perfection, while Connor's excellent but merely human performance looked ordinary by comparison. The crowd's energy had shifted from anticipation to something approaching awe as spectators realized they were witnessing something that transcended simple competition. Connor Walsh stood at his equipment station, his face a mask of barely controlled desperation. Everything he'd built his identity around, his regional championships, his instructor reputation, his carefully cultivated image as Nashville's premier marksman, was crumbling under the steady precision of someone he'd dismissed as an amateur. Just hours earlier, Station 9 presented the competition's most technically challenging scenario: multiple targets at varying distances, each requiring different ammunition types and rapid transitions between firing positions. It was designed to test not just accuracy, but adaptability, speed, and the kind of tactical thinking that separated genuine masters from talented amateurs. Connor approached the station with the movements of someone who knew this was his last chance to salvage both the competition and his reputation. His expensive equipment had been optimized specifically for this type of challenge, and his years of competition experience should have given him a decisive advantage in the complex calculations. Required. He completed the station with impressive competence, achieving scores that would have dominated most competitions. But impressive competence wasn't enough anymore, not when measured against the surgical precision Riley had displayed throughout the day. Connor's score was excellent. Riley's were perfect. As Riley prepared for Station 9, she could feel the weight of every eye in the facility focused on her movements. The crowd had gone beyond simple spectatorship. They were witnessing something that would become legend in Nashville's shooting community. The quiet woman with modest equipment was systematically demonstrating what genuine excellence looked like when it was built on character rather than ego. Riley moved through Station 9 with mechanical precision, her transitions between targets so fluid they seemed choreographed. Each shot found its mark with the inevitability of natural law, her performance so flawless that even Connor's supporters began shaking their heads in reluctant admiration. But it was Station 10, the final challenge, where Connor made his last, most desperate play. Station 10 featured the competition's ultimate test, a series of precision shots at maximum range using the facility's most demanding equipment. As Riley prepared her approach, Connor's equipment manager made one final modification to her gear, loosening a critical scope mount, just enough to introduce catastrophic instability without being immediately obvious. Riley settled into position for her first shot at Station 10 and immediately felt something fundamentally wrong with her rifle. The scope wasn't just misaligned anymore, it was actively shifting under recoil, making consistent accuracy impossible. Any other shooter would have been forced to stop and request equipment inspection, losing crucial time and momentum. But Riley Harper had been trained by Commander David Harper, who had spent years preparing her for situations where equipment failure meant more than losing competitions, it meant losing lives. She made rapid mental calculations based on the scope shifting patterns, then did something that made the entire crowd gasp audibly. Instead of using the compromised optic, Riley flipped up her rifle's backup iron sights, basic, unmagnified aiming devices that most modern competitive shooters had never learned to use effectively. At maximum range, using iron sights against targets designed for high-powered optics was considered impossible. The targets were barely visible as thin lines even with magnification. Without it, they should have been invisible. But Riley's father had insisted she master iron sight shooting at distances that seemed impossible, preparing her for situations where technology failed and only fundamental skill remained. She had learned to shoot by instinct and experience rather than relying on equipment that could malfunction at critical moments. Her first shot with iron sights hit dead center, producing an electronic score that made the entire facility fall silent. The crowd couldn't process what they just witnessed, someone shooting with basic equipment at distances where most people needed high-powered scopes, achieving results that defied rational explanation. Connor's photographer tried one final strobe attack during Riley's second shot, but she had moved beyond the point where such tactics could affect her performance. She was operating in a zone of pure concentration that her father's training had cultivated, where external distractions simply ceased to exist. Shot after shot found perfect placement, each electronic confirmation hitting the crowd like a physical blow. Riley wasn't just overcoming Connor's sabotage, she was demonstrating that genuine excellence transcended equipment, circumstances, or the desperate tactics of threatened competitors. As she prepared for her final shot of the competition, Riley thought about her father's last letter: use it when it matters. And always remember that the most important shot is the one that brings everyone home safely. This shot wouldn't bring anyone home from combat, but it would honor Commander David Harper's memory by demonstrating that his daughter had learned not just his techniques, but his values: excellence with integrity, precision with character, strength without arrogance. Riley's final shot rang out across Blackstone Firearms Academy with the authority of absolute certainty. The electronic confirmation came immediately. 10.0 points. Perfect score. The silence that followed was profound, not the stunned quiet of surprise, but the reverent hush of people who had just witnessed something that would be talked about. For decades, Riley Harper had achieved a perfect score across all 10 stations, overcoming equipment sabotage, psychological warfare, and deliberate interference while using gear inferior to her opponents. But more than that, she had demonstrated what genuine character looked like under pressure. Never complaining about the sabotage, never making excuses for the obstacles placed in her path, simply adapting and overcoming with the quiet professionalism her father had instilled in her. Connor Walsh stared at the final scoreboard with an expression of complete defeat. His excellent performance had been rendered irrelevant by someone operating at a level he couldn't comprehend. But worse than losing was the realization that his cheating had been witnessed by the entire shooting community. He'd tried to impress. Riley packed her equipment with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the competition, ready to disappear back into the anonymity that had protected her since leaving the military. She had proven what needed proving, honored her father's memory, and demonstrated that excellence couldn't be bought or intimidated. As she walked toward the exit, the crowd rose in spontaneous applause, not the polite recognition typically given to competition winners, but the kind of sustained ovation reserved for performances that transcended sport and became art. Riley Harper had entered Blackstone Firearms Academy as someone hiding from her abilities. She left as someone who had reminded everyone present what genuine excellence looked like when it was built on the right foundation. The final scoreboard told the story in numbers that spoke louder than words. Riley Harper, 500 out of 500 possible points. Perfect in every way that mattered. The video went viral within hours. Security footage from Blackstone Firearms Academy captured not just Riley's impossible perfect score, but every instance of Connor's sabotage attempts, the equipment tampering, the camera flashes, the deliberate scoring delays. What had been intended as Connor's triumph became documented evidence of his complete ethical collapse in the face of genuine excellence. By Monday morning, the footage had been shared across every major shooting sports forum, military veteran Facebook groups, and social media platforms where precision marksmanship was discussed. The comments weren't just about Riley's incredible performance. They were about the stark contrast between her quiet professionalism and Connor's increasingly desperate cheating. "This is what honor looks like under pressure," wrote one retired Marine whose post was shared thousands of times. She never complained, never made excuses, just adapted and overcame. Meanwhile, this clown is tampering with equipment like some amateur wannabe. Connor Walsh woke Monday morning to find his phone flooded with messages, none of them congratulatory. Sponsors who had supported him for years were demanding explanations for behavior that had been broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The Tennessee Shooting Sports Association had launched an investigation into his conduct, and Blackstone's board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the facility. But the most devastating blow came from Jake Morrison's article in Tennessee Shooting Sports Monthly. Morrison had captured every moment of the competition, and his piece was less sports journalism than character study, a detailed examination of what happened when genuine excellence encountered threatened mediocrity. Connor Walsh spent years building a reputation as Nashville's premier shooting instructor, Morrison wrote. On Sunday, that reputation died under the steady precision of someone who understood that true mastery isn't about defeating others, it's about refusing to be defeated by your own limitations. The article went on to detail Connor's sabotage attempts with clinical precision, contrasting each unethical act with Riley's professional response. The piece concluded with a paragraph that would haunt Connor's career for years to come. In trying to destroy Riley Harper's performance, Connor Walsh accomplished something far more damaging. He revealed exactly what kind of person he becomes when his carefully constructed superiority is challenged by someone operating at a level he can't comprehend. 3 days after the competition, Blackstone Firearms Academy held its emergency board meeting. Zoe Martinez presented a comprehensive report documenting every instance of misconduct she'd witnessed, supported by security footage that left no room for interpretation or denial. Connor's behavior wasn't just unsportsmanlike, Zoe told the assembled board members. It was a systematic attempt to cheat someone who had done nothing but demonstrate exceptional skill under pressure. This isn't about winning or losing, it's about the fundamental values we claim to represent as an institution. The board's decision was unanimous. Connor Walsh's membership was terminated immediately. His instructor certifications were revoked, and he was banned from Blackstone permanently. His name would be removed from trophy cases and his records expunged from facility documentation. Within a week, the man who had considered himself Nashville's shooting sports royalty was effectively persona non grata in the community he'd dominated for years. Meanwhile, Riley Harper returned to her quiet job at the accounting firm, trying to process what her public demonstration had unleashed. The $50,000 prize money had solved her immediate financial problems, but more importantly, it had forced her to confront questions about her father's legacy and her own responsibilities as his daughter, Dr. Patricia Lawson, called Tuesday morning with a proposition that would change everything. Riley, I've been contacted by the Veterans Affairs Department about a new program they're developing. Therapeutic shooting instruction for veterans dealing with PTSD and readjustment issues. They need someone with your technical skills and your understanding of what military personnel are going through. The offer was compelling, a chance to use her abilities for something meaningful while helping people who shared her experience of military service and civilian transition. But it would also mean stepping permanently out of the anonymity she'd carefully maintained since her father's death. There's something else, Dr. Lawson continued. 3 other veterans who saw the competition footage have already contacted me asking if you'd be willing to provide private instruction. They're not interested in competitive shooting. They want to reconnect with skills that made them feel competent and confident during their service. Riley found herself thinking about her father's letter. Find your tribe, sweetheart. Find people who understand what we've shared and help them remember why precision matters. Thursday evening, Riley received an unexpected visitor. Connor Walsh stood at her apartment door, his appearance showing the toll of the past week. Gone was the confident swagger that had characterized his behavior at Blackstone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. I came to apologize, he said without preamble. What I did during the competition was inexcusable, and you deserved better. Riley studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the damage to his pride. Why? She asked simply. Connor was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because you represented everything I pretended to be, but never actually was. I built my entire identity around being the best shooter in the room, and when someone showed up who was actually excellent, not just talented, but genuinely excellent, I couldn't handle it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I know the money doesn't matter to you, but I wanted to make a donation to the Veterans Affairs program Dr. Lawson mentioned. Maybe something good can come from the mess I made. Riley opened the envelope to find a check for $25,000, half the prize money Connor had put up for the competition. The gesture didn't erase his behavior, but it suggested someone capable of learning from his mistakes. Thank you, Riley said quietly. That means a lot. As Connor turned to leave, he paused and looked back. For what it's worth, your father would be proud. What you did wasn't just about shooting. It was about character under pressure. I hope someday I can learn to compete with that kind of integrity. After he left, Riley sat in her kitchen with her father's letter spread before her, finally understanding what he'd been trying to prepare her for. Not just the technical aspects of marksmanship, but the responsibility that came with exceptional ability. The obligation to use her skills for something larger than personal validation. By Friday, Riley had made her decision. She would accept. the Veterans Affairs position, and begin providing therapeutic shooting instruction for veterans struggling with readjustment issues. She would honor her father's memory, not by hiding from her abilities, but by using them to help others find their own path back to confidence and competence. The quiet woman who had entered Blackstone Firearms Academy seeking anonymity was ready to step into the light, carrying forward Commander David Harper's legacy of excellence, integrity, and service to others. Riley Harper's story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.